It was May 4th, 1971, at the Olympia Stadium in Detroit, Michigan. The spring air outside was finally warming after a brutal winter, but inside the packed arena, the temperature had climbed to nearly 85 degrees from the collective energy of 17,000 passionate fans who had come to see the King perform during his first tour since returning to regular live performances. Elvis was midway through an emotional rendition of "It's Now or Never" when something in the third row caught his eye, something that would transform an already powerful concert into a moment of profound human connection that would leave every person in that building forever changed. The man sitting in Section A, Row 3, Seat 12, was trying his best to blend in with the crowd around him, but there were certain things about his appearance that made him stand out to someone like Elvis, who had served his own time in the military and understood the unmistakable bearing of a professional soldier. The man's posture was perfectly straight despite the informal setting. His hair was regulation short, even though he was clearly off duty, and there was something in his eyes, a distance, a weight, that spoke of experiences most people couldn't imagine. His name was Sergeant First Class Robert Bobby Mitchell, though nobody in the arena knew it at the time. He was 24 years old, and just 6 weeks earlier, he had been in the jungles of Vietnam, leading a squad of 19-year-old kids through some of the most dangerous territory on Earth. Now he was sitting in a Detroit concert hall, trying to readjust to a world of music and laughter and normalcy that felt almost surreal after 18 months in a combat zone. Bobby had grown up in a small town outside Detroit called Roseville, in a modest house on Maple Street, where his mother still lived, still kept his childhood bedroom exactly as he'd left it when he shipped out for basic training 4 years earlier. He was the oldest of 3 children, and from the time he could walk, everyone knew Bobby was destined to serve his country. His grandfather had fought in World War I. His father had been at Normandy, and military service wasn't just a family tradition. It was a calling that Bobby had felt deep in his bones since childhood. But Vietnam wasn't World War II. It wasn't a clear-cut fight between good and evil with ticker tape parades and universal support back home. Bobby had experienced things in the dense, humid jungles of Southeast Asia that no training could have prepared him for, had made decisions that would replay in his mind for the rest of his life, and had watched friends, boys really, most of them barely out of high school, come home in flag-draped boxes while protesters spat on the soldiers who survived. The transition back to civilian life had been jarring in ways that Bobby hadn't anticipated. The sounds of Detroit traffic made him jumpy, scanning for threats that weren't there. Crowds made him nervous, too many people in too small a space with too many variables he couldn't control. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by memories and sounds that existed only in his mind, but felt more real than the quiet safety of his childhood bedroom. His mother, Helen Mitchell, had noticed the changes in her son immediately. The boy who had left for Vietnam had been quick to laugh, eager to share stories, and comfortable in his own skin. The man who came home was quieter, more watchful, and carried himself with the kind of hypervigilance that comes from months of knowing that relaxation could mean death. Helen had been trying everything to help Bobby readjust, to find moments of joy that might remind him of who he had been before the war. She had cooked his favorite meals, invited old friends over, and suggested activities they had enjoyed together when he was younger. But nothing seemed to reach him, until she mentioned that Elvis Presley was coming to Detroit for a concert. "Bobby," she had said one morning over coffee, "you remember how much you used to love Elvis's music? You had every record, knew every song by heart. Maybe we could go see him perform." Bobby's response had been lukewarm at first. Music seemed like such a luxury, such a frivolous concern after everything he had witnessed, but something in his mother's hopeful expression made him reconsider. Helen Mitchell had spent 18 months not knowing if her oldest child was alive or dead, had lived with the constant fear that 2 military officers would appear at her door with news that would destroy her world. If she thought an Elvis concert might help, Bobby was willing to try. Getting tickets had been Helen's project for weeks. She had called the box office repeatedly, had asked friends and neighbors for connections, and had finally managed to secure 2 seats in the third row through her supervisor at the factory where she worked assembling car parts. The tickets had cost nearly a week's wages, money the family could have used for other things, but Helen considered it an investment in her son's recovery. The night of the concert, Bobby had worn his dress uniform. It wasn't required, he was on leave, and civilian clothes would have been perfectly appropriate, but wearing the uniform felt important somehow, a way of honoring his service and the service of the friends who hadn't made it home. The army green fabric was perfectly pressed, his ribbons and badges positioned with military precision. His brass shined to mirror brightness. Helen had dressed carefully too, wearing her best dress and the pearl necklace that had been her mother's. She understood that this evening was more than entertainment. It was an attempt to reconnect her son with the part of himself that had existed before war had changed him forever. As they took their seats in the third row, Bobby found himself scanning the crowd with the automatic threat assessment that had become second nature. Too many people, too many potential problems, too many variables. But gradually, as the opening acts performed and the anticipation built toward Elvis's appearance, Bobby began to relax in spite of himself. When Elvis took the stage in his white jumpsuit with gold trim, the crowd erupted in the kind of joyful enthusiasm that Bobby hadn't experienced in over a year. The pure, uncomplicated happiness of 17,000 people celebrating music and life together was infectious, and for the first time since returning from Vietnam, Bobby felt something approaching peace. Elvis opened with several of his high-energy numbers, commanding the stage with the charisma and presence that had made him a global icon. That's All Right, Hound Dog, Burning Love. Each song sent waves of excitement through the crowd, and Bobby found himself singing along to lyrics he hadn't thought about in years, but somehow remembered perfectly. Helen watched her son throughout the performance, seeing glimpses of the boy she remembered, the quick smile, the unconscious swaying to the rhythm, the moment when he threw back his head and laughed at something Elvis said between songs. These were the first signs of joy she had seen from Bobby since his return, and she felt tears of relief and gratitude streaming down her face. It was during It's Now or Never, one of Elvis's most powerful ballads, that everything changed. Elvis was singing with particular emotion that night, his voice carrying the kind of vulnerability and strength that made his performances transcendent rather than just entertaining. The arena was quieter during this song, thousands of people swaying gently and singing along softly, creating an atmosphere of shared intimacy despite the massive size of the venue. As Elvis moved across the stage, his eyes scanning the audience in the way that had always made fans feel personally connected to him, his gaze fell on the third row and stopped. There, sitting perfectly straight in his army dress uniform, was a young soldier whose bearing and ribbons told a story that Elvis recognized immediately. Elvis had served in the army from 1958 to 1960 during peacetime, but his military service had given him deep respect for soldiers and an understanding of the brotherhood that exists among those who have worn the uniform. He could see in Bobby's posture and expression the signs of recent combat experience, the hyper-alertness of someone who had been in harm's way and was still processing the transition back to safety. Without breaking the song's rhythm, Elvis began walking toward that section of the stage, his eyes locked on Bobby. As he sang the powerful lyrics about seizing the moment and not letting opportunities pass by, it seemed as though he was singing directly to this young soldier, delivering a personal message about the importance of embracing life after surviving experiences that could have destroyed it. Bobby, realizing that Elvis was looking at him specifically, felt a complex mixture of emotions, pride in being recognized, anxiety about the attention, and something else, a feeling that this moment was significant in ways he couldn't yet understand. When the song ended, instead of moving immediately into his next number, Elvis remained near the edge of the stage, looking down at Bobby with an expression of genuine respect and curiosity. "Son," Elvis said into his microphone, his voice carrying clearly through the arena's sound system. "I can see you're military. What branch?" Bobby, trained to respond clearly when addressed by a superior, stood up automatically. "Army, sir. Sergeant First Class Robert Mitchell." "Sergeant Mitchell," Elvis repeated, his voice warm with respect. "Where have you been serving?" "Vietnam, sir. Just returned 6 weeks ago." The response rippled through the crowd like a physical wave. Vietnam was a controversial and painful subject in 1971, with the war still raging and public opinion deeply divided. But in Elvis's voice and manner, there was no politics, no judgment, only respect for a young man who had answered his country's call and paid a price that most people couldn't imagine. 18 months in country, sir," Bobby added, providing the detail that military personnel automatically shared with each other. Elvis was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of genuine emotion. "Sergeant Mitchell, I want everyone in this building to understand something. This young man has been fighting for our freedom while we've been enjoying the luxury of complaining about our problems. He's seen things and done things that most of us can't imagine, and he's done them so that we can sit here tonight and enjoy music together in peace." The arena fell silent, 17,000 people focusing their attention on this unexpected moment of recognition and gratitude. Bobby, uncomfortable with the attention but unable to sit down while Elvis was addressing him, maintained his military bearing while fighting back emotions he had been suppressing for months. "Sergeant," Elvis continued, "I served in the army myself, though not in combat like you have. But I know something about the brotherhood of soldiers, and I know that when you come home from war, sometimes it's hard to remember why you fought in the first place." He paused, looking directly at Bobby with an intensity that made the massive arena feel intimate. "I want to remind you, son, you fought for moments like this. You fought so that mothers could bring their children to concerts without fear, so that families could gather together and celebrate life and music and all the things that make us human. You fought so that we could have the freedom to come together in joy, instead of having to huddle in fear." The crowd began to applaud, but Elvis held up his hand for silence. "I'm not finished. Sergeant Mitchell, I want you to know that what you've done matters. The sacrifices you've made matter. And the fact that you're here tonight, trying to find your way back to the world you helped protect, that matters too." Bobby felt tears beginning to form, emotions he had been holding back since his return finally beginning to surface. The recognition, the respect, the understanding that Elvis was showing touched something deep in his soldier's heart that had been frozen since his return from the jungle. "Now," Elvis said, his voice taking on a different tone, "I want to do something special. Sergeant Mitchell, this next song is for you and for every soldier who has ever put on a uniform and stood between their country and danger. And I want everyone in this arena to understand that freedom isn't free. It's paid for by young men and women like Sergeant Mitchell who are willing to sacrifice their comfort, their safety, and sometimes their lives so that the rest of us can sleep peacefully at night." What Elvis did next became legendary among both Elvis fans and military personnel. He began singing Battle Hymn of the Republic, but his arrangement was unlike any version anyone had ever heard. It combined the traditional patriotic power of the hymn with Elvis's unique vocal style and emotional delivery, creating something that was both deeply respectful of American military tradition and unmistakably authentic to Elvis's artistic identity. As Elvis sang, "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord," his voice soaring with power and conviction, something remarkable happened in that arena. The 17,000 people present weren't just listening to a song, they were participating in a moment of national recognition and gratitude that transcended politics and controversy. People throughout the arena were on their feet, not in the usual screaming excitement of a rock concert, but in respectful acknowledgement of something sacred. Veterans in the audience were saluting, parents were holding their children, and everyone seemed to understand that they were witnessing something that went far beyond entertainment. Bobby, still standing in the third row, felt the emotions he had been suppressing for months finally breaking through. The tears came freely now. Tears of grief for friends lost, tears of relief at being home, tears of gratitude for being recognized and honored, and tears of something approaching healing, as the music and the moment combined to remind him of what he had been fighting to protect. Helen, standing beside her son, watched as the boy she remembered finally began to emerge from behind the soldier's stoic facade. For the first time since his return, Bobby looked like he was allowing himself to feel, to grieve, to hope, and to begin the process of integrating his war experience with his identity as a young American man with a full life ahead of him. When the song ended, the silence that followed was profound and reverent. Then, starting with someone in the upper deck and spreading throughout the arena like wildfire, the crowd began chanting, "Thank you, Bobby! Thank you, Bobby!" The chant continued for nearly 5 minutes, 17,000 people expressing their gratitude to one soldier who had become, for that moment, the representative of everyone who had served. Bobby, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support and recognition, could only stand there and accept the thanks of his fellow Americans while tears streamed down his face. Elvis, visibly moved by the crowd's response, approached the edge of the stage again. "Sergeant Mitchell," he said, "would you do me the honor of joining me up here?" What followed was one of the most emotionally powerful moments in concert history. With the help of security personnel, Bobby made his way to the stage where Elvis greeted him not as a celebrity meeting a fan, but as one veteran greeting another with the respect and brotherhood that military service creates. "Sergeant," Elvis said, speaking quietly enough that only Bobby could hear, "I want you to know that you're home now. The war is behind you, and your life is ahead of you. Don't let what you've seen and done in service to your country rob you of the joy and peace you've earned the right to feel." Bobby, finding his voice despite his emotions, managed to respond, "Thank you, sir. This means more than you can know." Elvis then addressed the crowd one final time about Bobby's presence on stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, Sergeant Robert Mitchell represents the best of America, young people who are willing to sacrifice their own comfort and safety to protect the freedoms we all enjoy. Let's make sure he knows that his service is appreciated and that he's welcome home." The ovation that followed lasted for 8 minutes, with the entire arena on their feet, applauding not just for Bobby, but for every veteran, every military family, and every person who had made sacrifices in service to their country. Elvis finished the concert with Bobby remaining on stage, the two men standing together as Elvis performed several patriotic songs and gospel numbers that seemed particularly meaningful in the context of the evening's unexpected focus on service and sacrifice. After the show, Elvis spent over an hour with Bobby and Helen backstage, learning about Bobby's experiences, his struggles with readjustment, and his hopes for the future. Elvis connected Bobby with Veteran Services resources and gave him contact information for counselors who specialized in helping combat veterans transition back to civilian life. More importantly, Elvis helped Bobby understand that seeking help wasn't a sign of weakness but of strength, and that the same courage that had carried him through combat could carry him through the challenges of coming home. The concert became known among Elvis fans as the night Elvis honored a hero, and among veterans as an example of how civilian recognition and respect could aid in the healing process that all combat veterans must undergo. Bootleg recordings of that evening are treasured not just for their musical content, but for the captured moment when 17,000 people came together to thank one soldier, and by extension, all soldiers for their service. Bobby Mitchell went on to have a successful career in law enforcement, using the discipline and skills learned in the military to serve his community in a different capacity. He often spoke about that night at the Olympia Stadium as a turning point in his recovery from combat trauma, crediting Elvis with helping him understand that his service had meaning and that he deserved to find peace and happiness in his civilian life. Helen Mitchell kept the ticket stubs from that concert until her death, considering that evening to be the night she got her son back, not unchanged by his experiences, but whole enough to build a meaningful life despite them. The story of that May night in Detroit serves as a reminder that sometimes the most important thing a performer can do is stop the show and recognize the heroes in the audience. That music has the power to heal wounds that medicine cannot touch, and that moments of genuine human connection can transform not just individuals, but entire communities. Elvis Presley proved that night that true greatness lies not just in entertaining audiences, but in using that platform to honor those who deserve recognition, to build bridges between different segments of society, and to create moments of unity and healing in a world that often seems divided by conflict and controversy. And Sergeant First Class Robert Mitchell proved that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear army green, and sometimes they need nothing more than recognition and respect to begin the journey back to the life they fought to protect.